Okay, welcome everybody. This is Synapse's third Thursday webinar on decarbonization of heating energy use in California buildings, plus a bit on rates. And today, the presenters here are Asa Hopkins. He's the primary author on a recent report, and myself, Melissa Whited. I'm a principal associate here at Synapse. And we will be hosting this webinar and answering any questions that come in. So just take a moment on the logistics. The webinar is being recorded, and we will be circulating the webinar, a link to the webinar, as well as all the slides following the webinar. All attendees have been muted, and you'll remain muted throughout the presentation, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear your questions. We do welcome participation. Please send your questions on the webinar to the email address that is on the screen. That's webinar@synapse-energy.com. And following the presentation, we'll go through those questions and try to answer as many as we can. If you do have any technical difficulties, for example, you can't hear or you can't see the slides, please notify the host via the WebEx chat feature. So with that, I'll get started and pass it over to Asa to talk about this report. And just a reminder to please join us for upcoming third Thursday webinars. The next one will be on December 20th. All right, take it away, Asa.
Thanks, Melissa. So I'm going to tell you all a little bit this afternoon about a report that we published in October that was commissioned by the Natural Resources Defense Council on decarbonizing California buildings, and particularly the heating sector of those buildings. So first I'll give a little bit of context of California buildings and their role in greenhouse gas emissions in California and their potential role in mitigating those emissions. Then we'll spend a little bit of time looking at the different technologies that could be used to decarbonize buildings and building heat, and the sort of current state and barriers of the markets for those technologies in California. Then we'll take a dive into the customer economics of decarbonizing buildings, look at both retrofit and new construction, single-family, multifamily, what it actually looks like from a customer perspective to adopt those technologies. Then I'll pass the baton to Melissa for a few minutes, and she'll talk a bit about the grid and utility system impacts of this kind of decarbonization, particularly where it uses electrification. Then I'll take the baton back and talk about California's current suite of policies and programs that relate or have some impact on the pace of building decarbonization, as well as a roadmap that we laid out in the report for different actions that policymakers and others can take in California to accelerate the pace of building decarbonization, and then we will take your questions and hopefully have answers to them. So a little bit about the context. California has quite aggressive greenhouse gas goals, and they've established those quite rigorously in statute, which means they're aiming for an 80% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2050. So you have to think about how you're going to get emissions down in all of the sectors all across the economy: transportation, industry, buildings, agriculture. Buildings represent 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. So even if you zeroed the emissions in every other sector, California still wouldn't meet its goals. In this case, for this figure, we've allocated the electric use to the sector that consumes that electricity. So the building sector being the dominant user of electricity, those emissions are present there as well. California has well-established and well underway policies to decarbonize electricity. So we want to look at the direct emissions, the non-electric emissions that come from buildings, and what the end uses are that are driving those emissions. And they are overwhelmingly space heat and water heat. So total direct emissions in California buildings, about 2/3 are from residences and 1/3 from commercial buildings. And then within each of those building classes, about 2/3 or more are space heat and water heat combined. In contrast to electrification studies done in colder climates, water heat is a larger fraction in California than it is in, say, Minnesota or the Northeast. If you were to think about what does it mean from a greenhouse gas standpoint to electrify that space and water heat in both residential and commercial buildings, say by 2030 you were able to electrify about 1/3 of buildings, 30% of buildings by 2030, the emissions, net emissions from those end uses would fall by about 18%. That is replacing the emissions, the direct emissions in buildings with some smaller amount of emissions from the electric consumption. That 18% fall in direct emissions from buildings would be equivalent to taking 1.5 million cars off the road or shutting off nearly 4 500 megawatt natural gas power plants running around the clock. So because of the scale of California, substantial changes in any sector do result in substantial reductions in emissions. So if we want to think about decarbonizing buildings and addressing space heat and water heat in particular, we're going to look at what the technologies are that are the most promising to do that. On the space heating front, that it's all about heat pumps. In particular, in California, because building stock in California is dominated by forced air ducted heating systems, largely due to the very high penetration of air conditioning, we want to look at ducted heat pump systems. And again, we're thinking in particular about air source heat pumps as the primary technology. Heat pumps are effectively air conditioners that can run both ways, and so the predominance of air conditioning works well potentially with a spread of heat pumps into those buildings. Ground source and water source heat pumps, where you can get to substantially higher capacities for heating and for cooling, are quite possible, particularly for larger buildings or even for district heating type applications. Within California right now, the heat pump penetration tends to be higher in Southern California, particularly the San Diego area, than it is in Northern California, largely because in a climate where relatively little heating is needed, folks have chosen the simplicity of adding heating to their air conditioner rather than having a full separate heating system. Again, heat pumps are not the dominant technology even in Southern California, but there is a distinct north to south gradient across the state. When thinking about actually adopting heat pumps and what has kept them from becoming a larger player in buildings in California, the first barrier is simply that they are a relatively unfamiliar technology in the state. There's a lot of inertia when you're looking at a new heating system or replacing a heating system to go with what you know, to replace in kind. Gas furnace is on its last legs, you replace it with a gas furnace, it's simple, but it does leave you with another couple decades of direct emissions from the building. So to think about how to engage in that choice that the customers are making. There have been regulatory barriers that have favored gas furnaces, particularly condensing gas furnaces over heat pumps, and those regulatory barriers are just now being reduced, so the market can be freed of that barrier. We'll get to those policy barriers and policy context a little bit later. And also, for homes in California that don't have air conditioning, adding a large electric appliance for heating could trigger the need for an electric panel upgrade, which is both a source of uncertainty and a potential source of cost for folks considering switching over to a heat pump. In terms of where the market opportunities are that are able to get around those barriers today, new construction or major retrofits where there are shell improvements are the primary opportunity in a context where you're not having to deal with that inertia to replace in kind because you're revisiting the heating and cooling system in the building from scratch or simply constructing it from scratch. Also, where electric rates are particularly favorable relative to gas rates or relative to delivered fuels like oil or propane, and also places where utilities offer incentives. Both Palo Alto, for example, and Sacramento are offering incentives from their municipal utilities, and that can particularly make it make more sense to consider heat pumps in those contexts. Where there aren't ducts installed, particularly in larger or, say, historic buildings, or where heating and cooling are needed at the same time, other type of systems like variable refrigerant flow systems and ductless mini-split systems can also make a lot of sense. On the water heating side, the story is predominantly about heat pump water heaters with a secondary role for solar hot water. Heat pump water heater products are available today with uniform energy factors of 3.75 or higher. For reference, an electric resistance water heater would have a UEF of around 1. A typical old school gas tank water heater might be 0.8. Condensing water heater might get into the 0.9. So the site efficiency of a heat pump water heater can be factors of 4 or 5 higher than a gas system. The performance of a heat pump water heater does vary based on where it's installed and the ambient climate, because it's pumping heat out of the air immediately around it. So you can see in the little figure on the right that the coefficient of performance increases with warmer climates, and also heat pump water heaters work better in garages than they do in basements or vented closets in California. Solar hot water can make sense, particularly for large commercial water users, but it's still, even for those folks, can require subsidies to make financial sense. The barriers to heat pump water heater adoption include space and airflow requirements having to do with those issues I mentioned before, where the heat pump needs to be able to have access to enough ambient air to pump the heat out of. Water heaters are perhaps even more so than heating systems have a strong customer inertia to replace a water heater in kind. Folks tend to replace a water heater on an emergency basis, to give me something exactly what I've got and put it right where it is and get hot water back in my building, which when you need potentially to run a circuit to attach a new electric appliance where there was a gas appliance, for example, that extra barrier of needing to get an electrician could be substantial. Building energy codes in the state have favored tankless gas water heaters over heat pump water heaters, although that's changing with the code coming into effect in 2019. And as with the heat pump for space heat, the large new electric appliance could, in older buildings, require an electric panel upgrade. So a similar primary current market opportunity in new construction, where the space and airflow requirements can be built in and adapted for from the beginning. The electric circuitry can be run. Also where electric rates are favorable or where gas service isn't available. And also in multifamily buildings where you can sort of run these products in series to create to heat large tanks of water can be a particularly effective and efficient context to use them. Other gas use in buildings responsible for a much smaller portion of emissions, but one that some folks, particularly in new construction, might want to be looking at, are cooking and laundry. If we do cooking, we look particularly at induction cooktops and ranges. This is electric technology that offers fast, responsive cooking, comparable to or even better than gas. The electric induction cooktops available today have been rated by Consumer Reports to be among the highest scoring ranges in cooktops, generally exceeding the scores even of the highest scoring gas cooktops. They do, however, have to overcome customer bias or perception around the preference for gas cooking. On the laundry front, heat pump dryers are becoming available in the U.S. There are a few models from 3 or 4 manufacturers that are becoming more generally available. Generally speaking, what a heat pump dryer does is dehumidify rather than bake the clothes that are being dried, which can be gentler on the clothes in the process. They can also be ventless. So you're simply moving water from the clothes into a drain and not having to blow out a bunch of hot air out of the house, particularly in a higher performing building where puncturing the building shell and needing to blow air out of the building can create heating and cooling load. That can be a real advantage. heat pump dryers are also more than a third more efficient than the electric resistance dryers otherwise available for electric use, for electric drying. We'll take a moment to look at the customer economics of, okay, so you look at those technologies, you say, all right, I want to adopt those in my building. What might I expect in terms of the net effect on my energy bill and on the sort of upfront capital cost of adopting, switching over to those technologies? So we looked at a very wide range of cases in this study, four primary building configurations, and then a bunch of cases within each of those. So we looked at the matrix of single-family and multifamily, new construction and retrofit. So each combination of those pieces. In the retrofit context, we did an analysis where folks would replace the space and water heating systems, but not their cooking or laundry. And for new construction, we looked at all-electric new construction, including induction, cooktop, and a heat pump dryer. In order to try to get a sense of what the range of outcomes are within each building type, we looked at what we call our base and advanced cases. Obviously, there's a whole lot of different gradation between these cases, but we wanted to try to bound the expectation on either side. So in the base case, we imagine no additional energy efficiency in the building, and whatever the default electric rate design is for the and gas rate design for the customer in each service territory. For the advanced case, we modeled additional capital cost for building shell and air conditioner efficiency, and also a more advanced rate design. Melissa will talk a little bit later about what we mean by that. But generally, we were looking only at the rates that are available from the California utilities today, but looking for the rates that offer more differentiation between peak and off-peak, lower off-peak rates, shorter peaks for on-peak. We also looked at a range of solar photovoltaics on each modeled home. From the code minimum for new construction, there's some solar required. For retrofit, code minimum is 0, up to the maximum amount of solar that we consider to be reasonable, which is the amount it would take to zero out the electric bill, or at least minimize the electric bill. We looked across 3 locations: the Bay Area using Pacific Gas and Electric rates, the LA Basin using SoCal Edison and SoCal Gas rates, and Sacramento using Sacramento Municipal Utility District electric rates and PG&E gas rates. We did, for each of these cases, look at the hourly load shapes and outdoor temperature-based heat pump performance, so as to try to capture the dynamics over the course of each day and over the seasons, what the actual load would be lined up against these time-varying electric rates. So I'll walk through 2 of these cases in a little bit of detail. First, the single-family retrofit case. I'll just explain this figure a little bit. On the left, we have using the left axis, the increase in upfront capital cost to decarbonize, to take each of the actions. For each case we're talking about in each area. The primary difference between the areas is how much solar PV goes into the home. And you can see that a home that doesn't have any solar does not need an electric panel upgrade and gets full value from the air conditioning that comes along with the heat pump. The capital cost can actually be smaller. That will explain that air conditioning piece a little bit. Because the heat pump is also an air conditioner, if a home is in need of both a new heating system and a new air conditioner, there can be substantial savings from replacing both of those things at once. At the other end of the extreme is a home in which someone put in a new air conditioner last year, and now they're replacing their furnace this year. If they replace the furnace with the heat pump, essentially have to throw away the remaining value of their air conditioner. So we tried to account for that cost. And so the figure says no AC. That means no value for the fact that the heat pump is providing an air conditioner. So that means the upfront capital cost is higher. So the high end of these bars is where you need an electrical panel upgrade. you're adding solar and you're getting no value from the air conditioner. So you get a wide range of capital costs from some amount of capital cost savings to more than $10,000 of capital cost increase from taking these actions for the home. All those actions then also change the customer economics on an operating cost basis, and that's the right-hand side of the figure using the right-hand axis. And here, there's a great deal of variation driven by some of the same factors, but some other ones. So the particular rate designs of each of the utilities, PG&E, Southern California Edison, and Sacramento Utility District, as well as how much solar PV is installed, are the driving factors between the low end, where the default rates and without solar can have operating cost increases for the decarbonized building, and then at the high end where operating cost savings of in Sacramento's case over $700 a year from using a time of use rate optimized amount of solar in the advanced improved building. So across all of these cases, it's a very wide variation. The payback, the simple payback ranges from immediate. There are some of these cases in which a home might have both capital savings up front and operating cost savings ongoing, to never, where there's an upfront capital cost increase and an ongoing operating cost increase. So a given building may see any range in between. Generally speaking, on a present value basis, we see life cycle cost savings if the home gets the full heating and cooling value from the heat pump and doesn't require an electrical panel upgrade. So if you're sort of biased towards the bottom side of the left side of this figure, but generally get better customer economics overall with photovoltaics and with more advanced rate design. Across these homes, greenhouse gas emission reductions range from about a third to about 2/3, depending on how much solar PV the home installs. If we look in contrast at the new building, where there's no cost for the electrical panel upgrade and no cost for and the home needs a new air conditioner from scratch. There's no existing system, and you can avoid the cost of piping gas infrastructure into the new home at all. You can get really quite substantial capital cost savings. So the left-hand side, only in a case in San Francisco with the largest solar system is there actually any increase in capital costs from building anything but this all-electric home. The operating cost savings remain substantial. There are, of course, some cases with less solar and less good rate design where there is an operating cost increase, but even in that case, those correspond to cases in which the home was much cheaper to build in the first place. But with a little bit more solar, with better rate design, you can have both operating or capital cost savings on construction and operating cost savings in operation, and immediate payback and life cycle savings in all cases. In this case, the greenhouse gas emission reductions across the scenarios range from a little less than half to about 2/3, again, depending primarily on how much solar PV is installed. Rather than walk through two more cases of the same story told in multifamily, I'll just describe it here. In this case, we examined multifamily with the low-income discount rates in California, the CARE rates. We also looked at the lower heating load for multifamily construction. So generally speaking, there are simply lower operating costs, as well as some amount of lower capital costs, but particularly lower operating costs, both because of lower load and because the rates themselves reflect discounts. So there are simply smaller differences between the gas and electric options, just because the overall number of dollars at stake in these decisions is simply smaller. Similar to the single-family case, however, the multifamily cases do show positive life cycle savings when you don't have panel upgrades, and they have better economics in new construction than in retrofit. I'll pass the baton over to Melissa and talk a little bit about what happens if a lot of these folks in all these buildings are to take these actions all at the same time or over the coming few decades.
Thanks, Asa. Yeah, so as part of our analysis, we thought about the scenario in which customers in the commercial and residential sectors adopted heat pumps for both space heating and water heating technology at progressively larger rates. So the graph here shows the impact that adoption levels from 10% to 90%, and that means shifting from natural gas to electricity usage, would have on the grid in terms of the energy consumed. So this graph shows how the monthly electricity consumption would change at different penetration rates. And you can tell as penetration rates increase, the electricity usage obviously increases, but primarily in the winter months. And that's just due to the seasonality of heating usage. And the next slide, we have the peak summer day and a peak winter day, and how these would be affected by increasing space and water heat penetration, heat pump penetration. This analysis assumed a 50% penetration. So 50% of all natural gas used for space and water heating would be then shifted over to heat pumps. And this is for CAISO as a whole. Of course, we are concerned about the grid impacts primarily on the peak days because the grid is sized to meet peak demand. California, like most of the U.S., is currently summer peaking, and we wondered, with all the additional heating load, electricity used for heating, if that would change to a winter peaking. And for CAISO as a whole, it would not. The blue bars, or the blue lines in this graph, show the winter loads, and the red, the summer loads. The solid lines represent current peak demand, and the dotted lines represent forecast peak demand if we just scale that according to the additional heating and water heating load from heat pumps. So for CAISO as a whole, we see that the summer peak demand just increases slightly due to the additional water heating electricity usage, and the winter load increases significantly. But for PG&E specifically, they see a lot more of the heating increase in the winter, and so we could see PG&E potentially becoming a winter peaking utility above penetration levels of 50%. All right, next slide. So in terms of managing the grid impacts, there are a lot of things that we could do to shift demand off of the peak hours and also to help California manage its duck curve. So expect most of you will be familiar with the duck curve, which reflects net load and the decrease in net load during the daytime hours when solar is generating significantly, and then the shift to the peak demand in the late hours, the late evening hours, and the very steep ramp that is required to move from the low daytime net load to the high evening peak load. Well, when we look at the hourly load profiles for space heat and water heat from heat pumps, we see that it somewhat follows the duck curve. It typically has more heating load in the morning and less in the evening, but there definitely is an increase in load in the evening hours, which, without any price signals to help manage, would not help improve the duck curve. So that's where the role of rate design comes in. So this slide shows two different graphs. The top one represents a load shape of either a heat pump water heater or air source heat pump for space heating in the top left, and the current load shape overlaid with a time of use rate design. This time of use rate design is a recent rate design proposed by Southern California Edison. It has about a 12-cent on-peak to off-peak differential, which is a peak to off-peak price ratio of about 1.7 to 1 in the winter, a little bit more in the summer. And it is trying to help address the duck curve by charging a lower price for electricity in the middle of the day when we tend to have large amounts of solar on the system, and a higher price in the evening hours, which provides a price signal to shift load to the either middle of the day or to other off-peak periods. So the basic idea with rate design is shown in the bottom graph, that we preheat our houses or we preheat our water to shift that load to the middle of the day when electricity is cheaper and the system can more easily make use of the additional demand on the system, more easily accommodate it. But in order to have customers actually respond to these price signals, the peak to off-peak price ratio needs to be strong enough to provide customer savings for shifting that demand. When we analyzed this particular rate design for Southern California Edison, we found that the average price or average bill savings for customers would be on the order of $5 to $7 per month, which may not be enough to actually encourage customers to actively shift their demand. Thus, we recommend stronger price signals be used. There's a rate under consideration right now proposed by Southern California Edison that's called TOU Prime, and this rate has a much stronger peak to off-peak price ratio, about 2.7 to 1, and that would provide a much stronger price signal and much greater savings for customers to shift their demand. And with that, I'll turn it back to Asa to discuss the policies and programs.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. So first I'll give a quick summary of the current policies in California that particularly have some impact on electrification or building decarbonization, or at least could have. While we were in the middle of preparing this report, California legislature passed and the governor signed a new law, Assembly Bill 3232, which requires the Energy Commission to assess how to achieve a 40% greenhouse gas reduction in the building sector by 2030. Basically, assessment of how the building sector can make sure that it is pulling its weight with respect to the greenhouse gas emission reductions that statewide targets are comparable by 2030. The state does have an economy-wide cap and trade program, but at the current prices of carbon that are in that program, they have minimal effects on the customer economics. However, the cap and trade program does provide a potential source of revenue. Senate Bill 1477, which also passed and was signed this year, uses that revenue to fund incentives for both very low emission new buildings and for clean heating technology. The California Building Code, Title 24, is shifting in 2019 to level the playing field between electric and gas heating, rather than having it tilted toward gas heating. The California Public Utilities Commission, CPUC, has a test that's referred to as a three-prong test that regulates whether regulated utility energy efficiency programs can engage in fuel switching activities. As that test exists today, it effectively prevents those regulated programs from engaging with and helping customers switch from one fuel to another. Historically, that test exists in part because of concerns about fights between the utilities, and there was concern about switching to electricity when electricity was a dirtier fuel, and that dynamic has changed since the test was adopted. The CPUC is looking at this test over the course of this year. Several municipal utilities in the state, in particular Palo Alto and Sacramento, are running electrification programs. Also, I believe that some of the aggregators, like in Marin County, are also looking at electrification. as Melissa mentioned, the utilities are in the process of shifting to default time of use rates away from an inclining block rate structure, which should have a net effect with that first shift of making electrification more reasonable for customers to adopt. Again, as Melissa said, there's still some ongoing proceedings about exactly what those rate designs will be and how big the differentials will be in those rates. Looking forward, our report recommends a suite of actions to help the markets for these different electrification and decarbonization technologies move from their current relatively nascent state to be more robust and real options that folks are considering and deploying in buildings all over the state. We classified these actions into 4 types. First, raising awareness and educating. Second, setting targets and developing plans. Third, removing regulatory and market barriers. And fourth, moving to transform the market and bring it to scale. So on the first piece, raising awareness and educating, this largely takes the form of using the applied social sciences, marketing and advertising, to try to reach folks and make sure they understand the advantages and disadvantages of different options for heating their homes and hot water. This involves identifying the selling points for low carbon options, which may have little or nothing to do with their environmental benefit. Heat pumps for space heat, for example, can be quite quiet and offer variable speed and increased comfort. There's also indoor air quality, other ways of getting at explaining to folks different kinds of benefits. Recognize also that different benefits can be relevant to different kinds of audiences, so that education and outreach campaign would need to take those kinds of considerations into account. Also, there's need for training and educating within the building industry itself. Changes in building industry practices will require changes in the workforce and their knowledge in terms of practices with respect to how to design where to place different pieces of equipment within a home, for example. And that's a promising area for public-private partnerships between the folks who would like to sell more of this equipment and the folks who would like to install more of it, and the public sector that might like to see the decarbonization benefits that come along with that. The second class of actions we identified is the importance of setting targets and developing plans. And AB 3232 is the first step on that pathway for California. The official governmental targets and plans provide increased certainty for markets. They provide context to draw in investment in developing markets and also in human capital. If you're a plumber and you're deciding to decide whether to really get into specializing in heat pump water heating and really understanding how to do maintenance, if you want to know that that market's really going to exist, it's going to scale, it's going to grow, and you can potentially differentiate yourself into that market. So California can build from the targets that have been tentatively established by AB 3232, develop plans that have intermediate or sub-targets going forward towards 2050, and plans should also coordinate policies and programs across different kinds of market actors. There are a number of examples of state targets and plans along these lines that have been developed primarily in the Northeast, in Maine, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont. In terms of removing regulatory and market barriers, the first piece of this is rate design. As Melissa mentioned, rates with high differentials between peak and off-peak can be both cost-reflective and improve the customer economics for electric space and water heating. These kinds of rates are not yet available for everyone in California who might like to use them, and they can also compensate the building owners for the grid services that are provided by controllable loads like water heaters. Another way to remove those barriers would be to offer financial incentives for heat pumps for space and water heating. These incentives offer both impact on the customer economics, but also offer an important signaling value. Upstream incentives help to prepare the market to address emergency replacement. For example, a distributor might be incented to keep heat pump water heaters on hand so that in the case of emergency replacement, there are products ready and available in the warehouse to get out to customers just as quickly as a one-for-one gas replacement might require. So there has been some funding, as I mentioned, from SB 1477, coming from the greenhouse gas cap and trade system. States that have started to offer financial incentives aimed at this sort of fuel switching other states have taken a similar approach of staying out of the regulated efficiency world to start with, and instead using funding from greenhouse gas programs. In the Northeast, that's funding from RGGI, and in California, it could be funding from the AB 32 program. Also, looking at the question of the role of those utility programs, looking at the eligibility and cost-effectiveness requirements for fuel switching within those programs. As I mentioned, the CPUC is examining that three-prong test, and we recommend an approach to cost-effectiveness screening that's based on the new National Standard Practice Manual issued earlier this year, in which the question of what's cost-effective, what's appropriate for a utility program is grounded in large part on what the state's policy objectives are, in this case, perhaps deep decarbonization. Finally, in order to transform markets and take these technologies to scale, updating and aligning building codes with those policy objectives would mean encouraging the lowest emission buildings in a fuel-neutral, performance-based manner that maintains customer choice. California could consider, for example, a zero-emission ready requirement so that buildings would not face substantial infrastructure barriers within the building should a future building owner want to go to zero-emission technology like heat pumps or heat pump water heaters. California can also support research and development. This means developing higher efficiency and lower cost products to help the market scale, increasing the options for load management. There's also a need over the coming decade or so to try to push and transition the market towards low global warming potential refrigerants. Among the promising options are carbon dioxide and also various hydrocarbons like propane, but there are regulatory questions, safety questions, other things to work out, as well as just pure technical research to find the right blend of refrigerants that give the highest performance while decreasing any sort of other risk. And also, buildings are unique, are diverse. Every building is its own creature in some respects, and there's a great deal of diversity for what's going to be the right products to meet different kinds of needs within the market. So right now there are some products out there in all of these classes, but greater diversity of size and configuration of are they split systems or all together as one? Are they large? Are they small? Are they intended to meet particular kinds of use? As the market grows, there'll be more scale in those niches. The products need to be developed to fill them. And finally, even if utility energy efficiency programs are not sort of tailored and turned towards these policy objectives, there is a great deal of potential synergy between electrification and efficiency and demand flexibility. Heat pumps for space heat work best in well-sealed and insulated buildings that have quality ductwork, which are all things that go along with overall energy efficiency and indoor environmental quality in those buildings. The utility programs, even if they don't promote electrification per se, could still be acquiring both summer air conditioning savings and demand flexibility when they are encouraging folks to think about heat pumps. So that concludes our quick tour through this report, and we welcome questions that you may send in. Again, we welcome questions. Please send them to webinar@synapse-energy.com. And our colleagues here have been looking at the questions as they've come in, and I think we already have a few, so I'll let them ask away and we'll get a discussion going.
Yeah, thanks, Asa. Right, so send your questions to webinar@synapse-energy.com, and we will answer those. So the first question that's come in it's just a technical question about the efficiency of the electrification technologies that we studied. What is the coefficient of performance or other metrics?
So I mentioned the uniform energy factor of 3.75 for the heat pump water heaters, and that's what we use for the customer economic analysis. Real-world performance based on studies that have been done shows that the real world performance, even of something whose coefficient of performance is 3.75, is somewhat less, around 3 or so. For space heating, for our customer economic analysis, we used systems with a coefficient of performance of around 3. But there are systems that are available that are higher efficiency than that. We just wanted to make sure that we were examining a product that was going to be widely available and not have some extra upfront cost.
Okay. Second question is about why the payback period is really relevant, given that we have no choice but to reduce greenhouse gases.
So I think that the way we were thinking about it in terms of market development is that the payback period and the customer economics is likely to be a universal concern across all folks who are thinking about when to make these changes in buildings. Even if folks might or might not be particularly motivated by an environmental motivator, or even if say you had a regulation that required transition, you'd still want to know whether you were substantially increasing costs for families, right? And think about what the mitigation options might be for that. We did all of that analysis without any of the utility incentives or rebates included. Whatever the 1477 funding might be used for might, for example, have substantial impact on the customer economics. And by identifying the kinds of cases in which the customer economics is particularly challenging, we might help figure out where to direct funds to the particular barriers that might be getting in the way of folks making this decision on a purely economic basis. So there's a question of using market forces, using regulatory forces to try to drive that transition. But in either case, you really want to understand what the customer economics is going to look like. So that's why we looked at it, and depending on what kind of path the state takes going forward, that it will matter more or less.
Okay. Then there's a question about whether there's any data that shows price signals actually resulting in changing behavior, and whether strong savings opportunities actually result in raising costs for people who don't change their behavior. So I can take that. Well, we've done a lot of analysis of rate designs and the impacts on customer behavior. And on average, time of use rates tend to reduce peak demand by around 4% or more. And we've seen peak demand reductions up to 20% or even north of that when you have very strong peak price signals. So it is true that many customers do respond to these price signals. Not all customers can or do respond. Some may not care, some may not be able to. And those customers, if they have a medical condition or anything like that, they're typically exempt from any time-varying rate program, and that's the case in California as well. But California is moving to default time of use rates because they provide a more accurate price signal. So customers who use more electricity during peak hours pay more because they're actually imposing higher costs on the grid. Customers who can shift their electricity usage off-peak are reducing electricity costs for all customers, and therefore they receive some savings on their electricity bills. On average, however, the rate designs are revenue neutral, so they're not actually increasing the overall revenues that are received by the utility. It is just changing a little bit who pays for the costs, and that's based on who's causing the costs. Other states have taken a little bit more gradual approach to rate design by choosing to implement opt-in time of use rates only. I imagine that eventually we'll see more states going to California's approach of moving to default time of use rates. But even in California, customers will have a choice to opt out of the time of use rate if they are unable to shift their usage or if they just don't care for time of use rates.
Melissa, do you want to add anything about the importance of enabling technologies for people being able to respond to rates? I don't imagine many folks are sitting there watching the rate structure and manually turning their that temperature set point on their water heater up and down.
Absolutely, and this is very true for water heaters that generally we're not even aware of when they're cycling on or off. So many technologies now are coming out with automatic controls that are Wi-Fi enabled, or thermostats that learn or can respond to signals from the grid operator. And so that's where we're headed, where folks can opt in to allow their technologies to respond to these price signals automatically and not have to be involved with manually adjusting their load. We found in the past with different pilot programs that those customers that do have a smart thermostat or some other technology tend to respond a lot more to price signals, as would be expected. Electric vehicles are also an example of a type of load that can be programmed to charge only off-peak. When a customer comes home, they can program their EV to only charge after midnight, for example. And when customers on electric vehicle time of use rates in California, they've charged 80 to 90% off-peak in response to the price signals that provide significantly higher on-peak prices than off-peak prices. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. And this is about heat pump water heaters for multifamily buildings. Are heat pump water heaters a solution for multifamily buildings as well as single family? And if yes, what size of building is the upper limit, if any?
So, different multifamily buildings do their water differently. Some multifamily buildings have separate water heaters per unit, and in that case, the heat pump water heater can be a fine option unit by unit. Again, that's likely to be a context in which there might be barriers around where the heat pump water heater is located. If it's located in a small interior closet, then adding ducting or changing it to have it be out on the back patio or something, can be a potential barrier or cost. But I think that question is more relevant and interesting for the question of large buildings that have central shared hot water. Here, I think that the systems that we've seen and heard about in our research are generally for serving up to say 50 or 100 units, not the absolute largest of buildings. Where in these cases where generally the configuration might, for example, there's a product from a company called Sanden that is a split system water heater where it's like an air conditioner where there's an outdoor unit and an indoor unit. The outdoor unit pumps heat into a storage tank inside, and you can combine, say, 8 condensers with 5 tanks, right, and sort of put them together in series and work to provide enough hot water capacity to meet the peak draw of a large building while sharing the cost of that system. So you don't necessarily need one full system per home because people aren't all showering at exactly the same time, right? But you can sort of design things to sort of match that load, that overall load shape. But by the time you're talking about the absolute largest of buildings, there I think you're in the world where you're thinking about sort of combined systems that are doing space and water heat and cooling, potentially with a water loop or a ground source, in that, in the context of a skyscraper building or something, you're in a pretty different world than you are. But for most California multifamily, that's either sort of townhome style, two-story units, or the sort of 5 or 6 story sort of half a block type buildings, those are all within the realm of scale of what you could meet with combined or single heat pump water heaters.
How about funding opportunities? You mentioned a couple of sources, and what about for community choice aggregation? Those customers, what sources of funding would they have to fund electrification of buildings?
So I think I'm sure there are folks in California who understand the particular dynamics of the roles of how the roles and responsibilities between the aggregators and the distribution utilities break out. But I do know that the Marin Community Choice Aggregation program is looking at doing electrification, and how to design a program to encourage folks to adopt the appropriate, most efficient technologies. That I think, one of the advantages and disadvantages of the aggregation context is more variation, more innovation potentially. That means a wider spread. It might mean some aggregators that are just not interested in this, right, and are not offering as much as you might get outside of the aggregation, but others that are really interested in pushing the envelope. So I think, I think a blanket answer is unlikely to be correct, but there are examples of folks trying to push things in this kind of direction.
Okay, here's another one about the study overall and the overall results. What if we applied the same methodology to New England? Would we be likely to see similar results?
I haven't crunched those numbers. I think generally speaking, I think the customer economics are probably a little bit less favorable in New England. The electric rates are comparably high to California almost, or it's hard to look at a California rate structure and in Massachusetts one's flat, one's time varying, one has tiers, one doesn't, right, and figure out exactly which one is higher. But electrification, customer economics is challenged by high electric rates. And also the northeastern states generally have not moved towards time of use rates. If high differentials on the time of use is helpful for improving the customer economics, in effect, most states in the Northeast have ratios of 1, right, between peak and off-peak because they simply have no differentiation. So that has potentially a negative impact on the customer economics of this. And meanwhile, gas rates in the Northeast are relatively low. Don't have the same relatively high level that electric rates do. So I think we probably wouldn't see quite as favorable economics if you picked a set of examples across the Northeast.
Okay, so we are at time. I want to thank everybody for joining today, and thank you, Asa, for that presentation. That was great. Again, our next webinar will be December 20th, and we hope you join us then. And for those of you who sent in a question that we weren't able to get to, we'll try to respond to you directly. Please don't hesitate to email Asa or myself. Our email addresses are on this final slide. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.